as Carol said, this is a day devoted to Grace Porter, Grace Young Porter. And first of all, this was her family's house, and Bert married into the house. Secondly, she was every bit his equal as far as being in a social realm. I have to confess that initially I thought of Grace at this age, and that is definitely, you know, where a lot of people that are still living here remember her, but she was much more than Bert's wife, and just kind of, we're all a sum total of our experiences. I think Alfred Lord Tennyson said, "I am a part of all that I've met," and Carl Sandburg, in a more frontier vein, said, "Handling honey, tar, or dung, some sticks to the fingers." So, for good or ill, we are a composite of all of our experiences. And she was no different. She was affected by that. She also carried the genes of her forebears, and she had some pretty important forebears as far as Winnebago County history was concerned. So, Grace was, first of all, a great-granddaughter. Her great-grandfather was Francis Rogers. Her mother was Hannah Pike. Hannah died when their two children were 12 years old and 5 years old. Mary Jane Rogers, the 12-year-old, would grow up to be the mother of Aaron Rogers, who was Grace's grandfather. After after Mary Jane's mother died, her father married Esther George. And this is the house that they built in 1859. It's the stone house. If you've ever been near the littlest church or the smallest church, it's the stone house that has had the roof fall in and those kinds of things, but it was quite the home back in the day. And this right here is, and I'm sorry, forgot my my pointer here, but Francis Rogers was the one who built this. And as they say, wait, there's more. First of all, he and his wife Esther and Mary Jane and Henrietta came to the area when it was still Indian territory in 1847. And they actually spent their first winter, I read this in the memories of Mary Jane Rogers Young, but they spent their first winter from 1847 to 1848 in Iowa, and their home consisted of straw stacks that were massed on four sides over which they arranged a room. Now, imagine an Iowa winter protected only by straw stacks and possibly fur robes over the top. And you can see they came from hardy stock. I was reminded of the German saying, "Für die erste Tod, für die zweite Brot, für die dritte keine Not," which translated, for the first generation, death. For the second generation, bread. For the third generation, no need. So Mary Jane Rogers lived in a straw stack, and Grace and her parents lived here. So you can see, as the generations go, they build one on the next. So Esther was quite an interesting person, but we'll get to her in just a bit. Francis was his place that he and Esther built, or their place, was a familiar overnight stopping place for travelers and early pioneers on a well-traveled road. It went from Fort Atkinson to Prairie du Chien, to Fort Crawford. And so there were many people passing back and forth. They came in 1847. That was before technically, they were supposed to be here, I think. They settled on land that was government land near Fort Atkinson. They worried about the Indians, and so that afforded them, they were about maybe 3 miles from there, so they felt that afforded them some protection. Francis Rogers, along with Lewis Harkins, founded Lewiston, or you might have heard of it as Louisville, or Louisville, depending on, I guess, the Louisvilles from the south. But at any rate, it is said that the two of them could not agree, and there were frequent quarrels, so finally, Lewiston / Louisville kind of dissolved. He was the father of Mary Jane Rogers, who married Aaron Young in 1849, and that's the first recorded wedding performed in Winneshiek County. So again, Grace comes from some very interesting early stock. Now, on to Esther. She was Francis Rogers' second wife. He married her the year that Mary Jane's mother died, but that's what they did. He had a 12-year-old and a 5-year-old, and you had to take care of them. And so Esther George was quite an interesting lady. Part of the strong women role models, I think, that Grace would have had. The Ho-Chunk people were their neighbors, and the fort afforded protection, as I said. Great-grandfather Francis and his wife Esther had really good minds, an independent spirit. They possessed strong convictions and courage. Esther was a Free Will Baptist. She read her Bible twice through each year, and her acquaintance with the sodden fort soldiers and the Ho-Chunk, some of the Ho-Chunk as well, gave her a strong enmity for liquor. And you'll see that reflected later too. Esther and Francis were also ardent abolitionists and maintained an underground railway station in Winneshiek County in a cave in the bluff behind their stone house, which you saw earlier. She also had, and I should say that she and Francis subsequently had 5 more children, and they actually, it's said in some literature, it was reported by those who knew her that she treated Mary Jane and Henrietta as if they were her own. So the other strong role models would be Mary Jane's stepsisters, or half-sisters, I should say, Martha and Clara, who became physicians. And it's interesting, Clara was the youngest of Francis and Esther's children, but she became the doctor first. What happened was, after Francis died in 1877, Esther and her children moved back east, and they were in Massachusetts. Martha became acquainted, well, Martha had married. She married Mr. Ripley. He came from a well-to-do mill family in Massachusetts. They went back there, and some of the family friends were the Blackwells. And if you remember your history, Elizabeth Blackwell was the first sort of licensed physician in the United States. So again, there was a connection. Also, Martha's husband, Martha had been a nurse. She was beautiful. She had black hair and gray eyes and very finely chiseled features. She was known as the Belle of the Little Turkey River and was quite a catch. Mr. Ripley caught her. They got married. They moved back east. He started a mill, and he was injured so severely that he had to stop working. He was disabled after that. She, when she was single, had wanted to be a Civil War Army nurse. But Dorothea Dix, and you know her too, did not want, she wanted 30 years and up women. that were plain. And she, you know, was told that Martha was too beautiful. So at any rate, that did not stop her. She went ahead and kind of found nurses to register and to enlist. And she also went around soliciting funds. One of the farmers in Winnebago County really pushed her off, and he said, okay, I won't give you money, but I'll give you all the potatoes that you can dig. And he looked at this very good-looking woman. Well, she fixed him. She came back the next morning. She started digging potatoes at 6. He was very disgusted because she had quite a pile by the time it was noon. But she reminded him, you said, and she dug until sunset. So she had this huge pile of potatoes to turn over to the Union Army. Anyway, again, a really persistent type person. She had nursed people here in Winnebago County as a young girl with diphtheria, and then she continued to nurse at people that she knew, especially the underprivileged types in Massachusetts. But when a small child died in her arms from membranous croup, she vowed she would either leave nursing or she was going to be a doctor so she could do something about it. And so she went, her sister, her little sister, was already a physician in Lawrence, Massachusetts, and so she went, and she had children of her own at that point, and became a doctor. So it took 3 years then. And she was, because her husband was disabled, she had to be breadwinner. So they moved to Minneapolis because prospects in Massachusetts were rather crowded. And Minneapolis wasn't the Minneapolis we know now. It was a very primitive mill city. And so when she went there, her work was cut out for her. She went ahead and was really almost discouraged from coming, but persisted again. Her family moved out there. They ended up, she actually was always a suffragist. She ended up being a professor of medicine and a social reformer. She opened the first maternity hospital for unmarried pregnant women and low-income pregnant women who were denied admission to the present hospitals in Minneapolis, which was a very radical move for that time. And it's interesting, her first 3 patients were a clergyman's daughter. Remember, these are pregnant and unmarried. Clergyman's daughter, a teacher, and the third one was a very young, destitute, unmarried immigrant girl. So she continued to welcome people like that, and she became one of the most outspoken activists for disadvantaged female rights of the time. She had carried food to the runaway slaves that were being sheltered by her parents, and the influences of her really strong New England family circle and stern frontier discipline made her fearless in standing up for what was right. As a suffragist, Martha counted Frances E. Willard, remember that name, you will hear it later, and Carrie Chapman Catt as her friends, so big names as suffragists. Just some background, Frances E. Willard was an educator, a suffragist, and founded the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And so again, the old demon rum, you know, and alcohol, there was, she fought against that. And I guess the reason I'm going into these people, because these were her people. These would have been held up as shining lights to her. When Francis Rogers Young was the 4th son of Aaron and Mary Jane's, so Aaron, excuse me, I need to go on to the next one. Okay, so Grace was a granddaughter. She was descended from one of only 2 soldiers who remained in Winnebago County when Fort Atkinson was abandoned in 1849. Aaron Young was born in Monmouth, New Jersey in 1824. He enlisted, first went to Philadelphia to work in the boot and shoe factory there at 13. Enlisted, and by the way, that was just kind of what you did. You left home about 13, 14, and were on your own. He enlisted as a recruit in the regular army in 1845 and fought in the Mexican-American War. And then he was stationed at Fort Atkinson in October of 1848. And after the Indians were moved up to Minnesota, when the post was evacuated then in February 1849, Aaron Young was left in charge. During that month, he married Mary Jane Rogers, and that was the first recorded wedding in Wenatchee County on February 11th, 1849. Aaron Young later opened a store, and I don't know if any of you are aware, but there is a Young Rhea Cemetery, and thank you to Stacy, who did a bunch of research on the Young family, because she is on the Pioneer Cemetery Commission, and they sort of refurbished this cemetery. In it are buried James, who is Aaron and Mary Jane Young's first child. When Aaron, he was gone, he was sent several places. Mary Jane stayed at home with Francis and Esther. And the census in 1850 records that she had a child. They had a child by then. And so I'm thinking, just because of the birth order, this would be James. But sadly, James died in 1853, and so that is his stone. Then they have another daughter buried there, and Mary, and she was also, I think, quite young. No pun intended. But the cemetery was named for Aaron Young. It is not far. It's on private land, sheltered by a cornfield or soybean field, depending on the season. And I have been there with the Pioneer Cemetery Association, and thank you to Stacy for these pictures. But it is really hard to see, perhaps, but this is a very typical New England cemetery. It has a dry stone wall all the way around it. And there's also a young Civil War veteran who died, and they had a dedication, I guess, of his stone. It had never been marked. So this is how I became acquainted with this. So you might be interested. Aaron, and again, Stacy found this for me, his military record said he was 5 feet 7 3/4 inches tall. He had gray eyes, brown hair, and a light complexion. So you can kind of picture Aaron. We don't know about Mary Jane Rogers. I did find a very interesting daguerreotype in the Porterhouse collection, and I'm just pretty convinced that's, probably Aaron and probably, excuse me, Mary Jane, but we'll never know. It's not marked. Okay, so then Grace was a daughter, and I felt that I could give you a German translation because the mother was directly descended from German parents. So Emma Jacobs Young, and her given name was Clara Emma Jacobs Young, and Francis, or Frank Rogers Young. And as I said, he was the fourth son of Aaron and Mary Jane. And maybe first, Grace's mother, she was born in May of 1857 in Philadelphia. Her parents had emigrated already. Nicholas Jacobs and Julia Josephine Janish Jacobs. So anyway, sort of like John Jacob Jingleheimer's. But she came with her parents to Iowa when 10 years old, lived on a farm by Fort Atkinson. And her parents sent her to school in Decorah during that time. It became very apparent she was very intelligent, and so she was sent here and eventually married Francis Frank Rogers Young, December 6, 1876. And 2 daughters were born to them. It's kind of interesting. I found a note from the principal in Decorah. His name was Professor James H. McGoffin, and he said, so anyway, she made her mark there. This letter is dated May 14th, 1869, praises her progress, said she was promoted last week to a room 1 step higher, and if she could remain through this term, I'm persuaded she would have been able to go higher yet. So, Emma, very fine mind. The rest concluded, we're sorry to have her leave, and if you send her back in the fall, we shall be delighted to welcome her. So that's Professor J.H. McGoffin, the principal, and he had pretty atrocious handwriting. I had to go do a search through the old papers to find out who was principal then. Phyllis Lessett, and I owe a lot, I owe a lot to your mom because she also did some very fine research here. In a paper prepared for Monday Club said Emma grew into a very intelligent, talented, and rather forceful woman, well qualified to teach her daughter Grace the art of gracious living. So next we will meet Frank Young, born at Fort Atkinson, as I've said. You know who his parents were. Just a moment. Take a drink here. His boyhood was spent on a farm near Fort Atkinson. He married Clara Emma Jacobs on December 6, 1876, went into the hardware business, or mercantile business, moved to Decorah in 1894, and actively involved in the livestock business. His obituary said he was a kind and loving husband and father, quote, very much a home man devoted to his family, unquote. Just interestingly, they moved to Decorah in 1894 when Grace was would be a freshman. And Eastside was new. That was the first year for Eastside. And they actually lived near Eastside. Their first home was there. So, all right. So, anyway, then when I'll tell you more about when they came here. Grace was a sister. Grace was born, Grace Adele, born in August of 1880. Martha Ellen, her sister, was born December 1st, 1882. And very sadly, Grace and Martha Ellen only had 5 years together. You'll see photos of them upstairs, as well as a drawing of Martha Ellen. She died of consumption March 7th, 1888. She was 5 years old. And very strangely, they never marked her grave. She is buried in the Fort Atkinson, what was termed the Fort Atkinson Protestant Cemetery. It's actually located behind and next to a pile of tires at the implement dealership that's on the west side of Fort Atkinson. And I know several people who have lost their children, both young and older, and it's very hard sometimes to acknowledge that death. And so Martha Ellen's grave was never marked. And Grace waited until her father had died. Her mother died 3 months after her mother died. She bought a stone. And they actually have the invoice. It was a Rock of Ages, which is a very good stone, and had Grace's favorite roses up in the corner. And I actually went and photographed this. Thanks to Stacy's tutelage, I cleaned the stone. It had orange lichen all over it, and I hope to, after maybe a little more time, rain activates that. It's a biologic, so it's okay to use. They use it at Arlington Cemetery and on the White House stone, but I'm hoping that it will be clear. I think, actually, I don't know how well these are communicating here, but it's really pretty good. You can at least read it now. But anyway, okay, and Grace was a friend. She lived in Fort Atkinson. We don't really know much about her friendships there, but obviously she went to school. She was also schooled by her mother, and they moved to Decorah when she was 14 and would be ready for her freshman year. And in the group of pictures that I went through, I found a picture of Kate Portman. Kate Portman's father was R.F.B. Portman. He was, wrote the book about the English colony of 1872, and she did not go to school, however, with Grace. She was sent to an Episcopal boarding school in Davenport, Iowa, like a good English girl. The English send their children to boarding school. But she lived about a block down the alley. And I found other kids, young people's photos in there. So I have to assume that she knew them. And R.F.B. Portman signed Grace and Bert's wedding, as a guest. So we know that the families were involved together. And that's something, too, I should point out. Emma and Frank were involved with the upper echelon of Decorah society. So anyway, they were of the upper echelon. Okay. In 1898, they moved here, and Grace happened to be a senior in high school, and the boy next door, or more across the street, the White House with the black trim, which is unfortunately not what it used to be as far as really nice. It was a house that was built in the 1850s, had a lot of wonderful Gothic Revival trim, and actually Bert kind of denuded it in the 20s. So at any rate, he was, like a good English boy, at Lawrenceville Prep School in New Jersey. So they knew each other over the summer. And as time went on, they became very good friends. Grace was invited to his graduation at Lawrenceville, New Jersey. And the parents took a dim view of that. But they loved their daughter, their only daughter, and finally they consented to have her go, and she stayed with family members out there, and she also made a lot of new friends out there. So here's Bert when he graduated from Lawrenceville. But their association was not without bumps. Grace liked staying out there, and she stayed out there all summer. Bert wanted her to come back here to Decorah because he was coming back here. But she was a woman of her own mind. Remember, her mother was quite forceful, according to Phyllis Lessett. Anyway, she stayed until the middle of September. She was not going to be coerced into coming back home. She wrote later in the summer, Bert and I are somewhat on the outs, and I don't know how it's going to turn out. We seem to be just on the verge of a breakup, and he seems to think I'm to blame. Well, I'm enjoying my time here at the seashore immensely. Tonight, there's a crowd of us going to a festival on a straw ride. She wasn't coming home. And she did say in another letter, she thought Bert was a bit jealous. But wrote just several days later, Papa and you must not misjudge Bert or worry about our differences. The whole trouble is my not writing him and my indifference toward him while here. Bert's all right. She was having too much fun. Bert's all right, and we'll be all right when he gets a little older. So, mature 18, 19-year-old. Bert and Grace were married 4 years later. They obviously settled their differences. June 1904 at the Young House, and you will see where they were married. Perhaps it helped that when she returned in September, she sent Bert a box of fudge in November, and he was out in the Dakotas trying to work at the job that his father had set up for him. Or perhaps it was just because they were 4 years older. So, okay. Grace and Bert were married in the music parlor on June 22nd, 1904. And the paper reported that at 8 o'clock, the bride and groom descended the stairs to the strains of Mendelssohn's Wedding March, played by Mrs. Jessie Irvin Marsh, and assumed positions in the bay window of the parlor where the wedding took place. The house was handsomely decorated with ferns, field daisies, and peonies. So I think that must have been a cold May, because normally peonies are done by then. But anyway, then the honeymoon, at 11 o'clock, the bridal party departed for Minneapolis, where his parents, his stepmother and his father lived. And his father's private rail car, those were the old-style RVs. You just hooked up to the train, and they pulled you where you wanted to go. And it had, as I said, belonged to the groom's parents, or father. They visited with Bert's parents in Minneapolis and then went on to Duluth, where Bert had held one job, but at that present time he had a clerical job with the Zenith Furnace Company. So, it isn't quite so simple as Grace was homesick and Bert was anxious to return to Decorah, but after 3 months in Duluth, they returned to Decorah to live with her parents. And they were to live at 405 West Broadway for the rest of their lives. Bert's grandfather, Mr. Field, had died, and he was deeded the house, and so one of the reasons was they feel he was having to look after the property. But they liked Decorah better than Duluth. I don't know if it was the winter or not, but probably moving toward that. So, whoops, and I think I skipped one. Yeah. Anyway, here they are on the porch, and they just thinking more about Grace. She was an artist. And you will see that, and hopefully if we can make Jane Kemp's video work, that you'll see the video that with a lot of information from Jane. Emma was the head of the house. She didn't expect Grace to do cooking or cleaning. Grace was encouraged to pursue her own interests, and one of those was being an artist. She became an accomplished china painter. And look at the needlepoint on the chairs, because that's her handiwork as well. Now, as an art educator for 42 years, let me tell you, Grace knew how to model a form. She was very good at nuanced color, and she did a good job with her compositions. So, Grace gets an A. Okay. I don't know about the origin of this picture. I found that, but I love it. It looks like perhaps Grace was in a play. She enjoyed plays, but, excuse me. She was an accomplished pianist and singer. She liked playing the piano and having others play for her and her friends, had concerts here at the house. Grace and Bert enjoyed going to plays, musical events, and I wish you could see that picture more clearly. It's pretty good. Grace was also an adventurous traveler. She was a full participant in many of Bert's travels. I love the 20s bathing suits there. And thank you to Peg Beatty for finding that one. Also, I don't know if you can see it, but it says Porter's Pass, steep grade, and underneath it says Christ Church, 10 miles that way. They were in New Zealand. And that was on their last trip that they took. Unfortunately, Grace fell in Japan and broke her leg and had to be in the hospital. So at any rate, they traveled a lot in between. She was also a team player. I don't know if any other woman could have been married to Bert Porter, because he demanded a lot. He was gone sometimes for a year at a time, and first, she and her mother accompanied Bert on some of his travels abroad. They stayed in hotels while he was out in the wilderness. catching his butterflies and following his own pursuits. But she stayed at home too when he was on some of his extended trips, supported him from afar. And she encouraged Bert in many of his interests. So she was a good woman. Grace was a gardener, and you can see the pond, the lily pond out here, and you can see the gardens that she started. And there are a number of pictures of her working in her garden that Bert has taken. She was also an activist. At her high school graduation, Grace gave an oration on Frances E. Willard. You've heard about her before. She was an educator, a social reformer, founded the WCTU, and Grace called it an uncrowned queen. Greatly admired her, someone that her great aunt had been in close contact with. Grace became a Monday Club member 2 years before her marriage, and that is a club that is still going. They learn about current events, and they also take up causes to promote welfare of people. One of theirs was they campaigned door to door to set up a local library. And she was also well versed in current events, and she was a suffragist. And it was written on Julian Dubuque stationery. It was a draft copy of a resolution that apparently was being put forth by, I think it was, if I read correctly, it was the Women's Club Federation in Monday. She was there as a Monday Club member. But the entire text reads, I think you can read Federal Suffrage Amendment on the first page on the Julian Dubuque stationery. Bad copy, but I didn't have a good luck with taking a picture. In full sympathy with President Wilson's statement that the enfranchisement of all women in our country is essential as a war measure to be consistent with our position as leading, and she's meaning the United States, as leading in the world struggle for democracy, we urgently request the Senate of the U.S. to pass the federal suffrage amendment during this session, and we ask for its early endorsement by the Iowa legislature. We also take deep pride in the fact that both Iowa senators are always in favor of women's suffrage. Respectfully submitted by the Resolution Committee, for signature, Mrs. Grace Porter. Then there's a really bad fold on the piece, and it's an old piece of paper. So second person is kind of a question mark, but then Mrs. Lillian Blunt is the third signatory. So, at any rate, she definitely was for women's suffrage. She also advocated, along with others, shortening women's working hours, making certain soldiers' wives and families at home were taken care of during World War I. So, we could talk more about Grace, but I think to actually see the artifacts here, to see where she lived and entertained here and worked, we do know she was multifaceted. She was a woman of substance and another uncrowned queen. So, okay, thank you. Thank you. As part of Stacy Gosling's study for the Pioneer Cemetery Association, she worked on a timeline, and sometimes it's hard to keep all these people straight, but I think this should make it very straightforward. The people that are marked with yellow are buried at the Young Rhea Cemetery near Fort Atkinson. And here would be Grace and Bert, which sadly the line did not go on, but here would be the children of Aaron and Mary Jane, and then here would be Mary Jane's mother here's Frances, her father, her stepmother, who was like a mother to her here. So if you want to take a look at this, I will leave this out here so you can see it. And are there any questions that you might have? Yes?
Do we know why Bert and Grace did not have children? Did they not want children?
I don't know. So when I was doing a session as a docent, they said, well, you know, he was really not home a lot. so I don't know. I don't know. David?
In the library, there's at least one book on birth control. And I'll bet Bert was not the reader of it.
Yeah. Probably not.
Or maybe they did this really lucky.
Yeah. This could be. Yeah, that would have been an interesting descendant, I think. Someone we would have heard from, I'm sure. Any other questions? Yes?
Could you review how they financed their life? It isn't clear to me.
Oh,
Where did
yes,
they get their
and I
money?
was, you know, they were trust fund babies, really. Grace's father pursued actively until several weeks before his death. He was a livestock buyer, and he had a really good business there. He had sold his hardware business when he moved here to Decorah. His obituary mentioned that he went to Chicago a lot and traded at the Union Stockyard. He had a very big company. The Union Stockyard sent a condolence card to the family. So Grace was his daughter, and she lived in the house. So that was Grace's support. Bert's father had a number. He was very wealthy. Started out about the same time that Conover, was an entity, and Cargill, William Cargill, was there. And I just we did a bus trip, and Conover was on it. And in my study there, just kind of an interesting sidelight, Cargill, if he could have bought land, would never have been a grain terminal magnate. He came here, and all of the soldiers returning from the Civil War beat him. And so he was working at the loading corn and wheat at the terminal, and thought, I could do this more efficiently. So, he ended up doing that, and probably about the same time. It's not clear if the two were associated together, but they certainly knew each other. The Cargill Corporation, I don't know, they haven't responded when there have been queries about the connection there. But Bert's father got into it early on, and Bert stayed with his grandparents. His own mother, Adele, died when he was not even 2 yet, of consumption, tuberculosis. And so he grew up here, but his father would visit him. And then he set Bert up. He tried to get him interested in different jobs. You don't send your son to North Dakota in the wintertime if you want him to become interested in the business. But eventually, he supported Bert. Obviously, he let them use their rail car. He set up a trust fund when Bert got married. And then later, when he died, he took care of him handsomely. So the two of them basically were taken care of, and so they could pursue their own interests. So, and as I said to one of the groups that I led, could have sat on the porch and drank beer, and someone said, no, that's a pretty good life. At any rate, he, and this isn't about Bert, but he did some very meaningful work. Kirk Larson in the biology department up at Luther used one of Bert's studies and expanded upon it. Bert's was in the early 1900s, and then he did one in 2009 related to that, and then one in 2015 about the presence of moths and butterflies and the species. And the species, as we know, have gone down radically. But, you know, Bert hadn't done that, and he was very recognized. And then Grace obviously had her own pursuits and made a difference. In Decorah, certainly, and, you know, we don't know, larger world, but for sure. So that's how they did it. They had family money. So